One thing that strikes me and impresses me about the scriptures is about how honest they are about human life, about the trials and struggles, about its fragility, about its frustrations, about its monotony. The famous book of Ecclesiastes, for example, Qoheleth, begins with that famous phrase, vanity of vanities, everything is vanity. What use is it to go about our daily work? What use is it living? What use is it striving? Very pessimistic point of view, and nonetheless accurate about the way we often enough feel about our lives, people feel about their lives. And there it is right in the Bible, right in the scriptures. Some of the Psalms speak about, for example, our life is like a flower in the field that rises up in the morning, and in the evening withers and is gone. You get old fast. Life is transient. And certainly the book of Job in the first reading we have today is a very eloquent presentation of it. Speaking about the monotony of our job, I feel like a hireling. My life is just like a slave. I'm waiting for my evening paycheck, my monthly, weekly paycheck, whatever it is. And that wonderful line, wonderful. I mean, it's very graphic, very expressive. It follows where it says, I'm lying awake at night and saying, when is the morning going to come? And I'm tossing and turning all night long. The night drags on. Insomnia doesn't sound like something from the Bible, but something from a NyQuil commercial. And that's how contemporary it is and how true it is. And if you look at some of the words, if you look further into some of the words that are used in the original Hebrew, it's even more expressive. For example, that first phrase where it says, isn't human life a drudgery? It's a good word. The word in Hebrew is Saba, the same word that's used in the phrase Lord of Hosts, Dominus Sabaoth. Saba literally means a warfare. Isn't life a combat? A daily battle? That's very expressive. Very true to life as well, often enough. And when it says, my life is swifter than a weaver's shuttle, the word that's used to describe that swiftness, that lightness, that passing quality, also a word that has another meaning of cursed in Hebrew, kalal. In other words, it's so passing away that it's just as if it were cursed. And not to mention the weaver's shuttle. I just got back from Asia where I saw up close weavers at their shuttle. And it is very impressive how quickly they move and how fast it passes. Or the word where it goes on to say, life is futile. Shao in Hebrew, which modified is the same word we get, shoah. The desolation, the destruction that so often comes in life. So it has all these words which express this frustration about life and this trial which is our life. So is that it? I mean, where is the salvation there? Well, I think the first message about it is you have to begin by accepting it, realizing it, being with it, realizing, as Eckhart Tolle says, you've got to start with the acceptance of the fact that this is the way life is. It has been said very well by a modern writer that religion is about what you do with your pain. The pain of human life that we've been talking about. And if religion is not squarely facing and dealing with that pain, but creating some kind of pie in the sky or palace in the sky nonsense, then it's not doing its job. Or we're not letting it do its job. We're approaching it the wrong way. And Buddhism is another eloquent witness to this fact of human life. The first noble truth of Buddhism is that life is dukkha, life is suffering, life is inadequate, insubstantial, unsatisfying. In other words, whatever religion you're following, if you try to find some kind of control or identity or stability, you cling to anything as a way of finding identity and security, you're doomed. It doesn't work. The Christian scriptures, the Hebrew scriptures are eloquent about that as well. That clinging, the second noble truth, is what brings us our suffering. And there's a famous sutra which says, human life is like a flash of lightning, like a bubble. It's like clouds, it's like hoarfrost, which we see around us. It's like a dream. Life is but a dream, the song says. So once again, is that it? Is that all there is? Well, one of the clues is actually in that first reading where it says, my life is but a breath. Well, many religions, including Christianity, sometimes use the breath in prayer as a way of access to God. So the very thing that passes, that is so fleeting, life is but a breath, as the scriptures themselves say, is also the way of access to God. The word in Hebrew is ruach. That Spirit of God is also just the passing breath. So somehow in that passing breath, we also can access the Spirit of God, which then gives us what? Well, it gives us access to a God who gives us hope, it gives us strength, it gives us meaning in the midst of that life. But we have to start there, at that bottom place. Why? Well, Jesus did. The whole mystery, the whole majesty, the whole genius, if you like, of the incarnation is that God comes down right into us, right into the fragility. The word became flesh. Basar in Hebrew, which just means this very fragile, ephemeral, delicate, vulnerable reality. So that's where we find God. So that's what Jesus took on. We see Jesus dealing with it in the gospel so beautifully and so eloquently today. Coming right into the mess of human life with its various diseases and its possession by all sorts of demons which are still around us today and in us today. So he's right down there with us. Following his own ruach, following the Spirit of God in him, which is impelling him to come right into the mess of human life. We'll find his mission there. So the Spirit of God gives us that mission as it gave Jesus the mission. And it always means to go into the nitty-gritty of human life, not run away in some false spiritual realm. Come down into the nitty-gritty of our human lives and others' human lives in compassion, in healing, sharing the weakness, our own human weakness. And because we recognize we're weak and vulnerable, we're able to deal with our fellows in that same spirit, the weak and the vulnerable, in that same spirit of compassion and fellowship, which Jesus himself exemplified. As the letter to the Hebrews says, he was not afraid to call those of flesh and blood, in which he fully shared, those of flesh and blood, his brothers and sisters. So he's right down there with us, showing the way to find God is right through that situation and in that situation. And Jesus was not afraid, for example, to become unclean in the midst of that. So often people try to find security in religious observances and traditions and something they can cling to and feel superior about it. It's all just an ego show. That's not what God is looking for. Blessed are the poor in spirit, those who come in their poverty, those who are honest about the human situation. He takes on all the purity laws. People came to him at night because that way the Jewish purity laws only lasted until evening. When he touched all the sick, he wouldn't be unclean for very long. They were doing him a favor, but he didn't care. Touching Peter's mother-in-law, the same thing. He rendered himself unclean. Who cares? Human life is a mess. And Jesus was not afraid of digging down deep into that mud, into that sludge, and sharing in our lot, giving us the example and the inspiration and the power to do exactly the same and not to run away from it. Paul gives an eloquent witness of that in the second reading today. First of all, he accepts that same vocation that we can all have in the Spirit of God that Christ did himself. He says, woe to me, he says, if I do not preach the gospel, even if I am reluctant to do so, it's nonetheless something with which I've been entrusted. It's my task, ultimately my joy. And then he says, so I have become all things to all people. See, that's the genius of the particular, again, the particularity of human life. The immediacy of human life. You don't run away from the particular. So you go right into each person's circumstance, right exactly where they are in the midst of their distress and their pain and their depression and their suicidal thoughts or whatever it might be. And you enter into that. I become all things to all people. He says, to those who are weak, I became as one who was weak. And by the way, in the context of Paul's writings and of Paul's situation in the community, he's talking about those who felt that they had to keep the old Jewish laws. He says that they're the weak people. They're looking for strength and identity in the little traditions and devotions, just what I was been talking about. He calls them weak. But he says, I became weak with the weak. Because I myself share weakness. I'm able to enter into other people's fragility and fear and insecurity because I share that same thing, and I can do it compassionately. I'm not running away from it any more than Jesus does, and Jesus is with me with His Spirit in the midst of that. Wouldn't it be fantastic if more people, including priests and bishops, were able to do that? Enter into another person's fragility and fear and weakness, because we also share fragility, fear, and weakness, and enter into it with compassion and healing and hope and empathy and sympathy and being with, sharing, not standing back in judgment or superiority and all this ego nonsense that's always happening, but actually having the courage to do that. That would really be healing for people. If we could feel that people meet us where we are, if we were able to meet people where they are. I think Pope Francis is trying to do that more and more, steering the church in that direction. But we shouldn't be afraid of it. It's the whole point of the incarnation, as we're trying to say, to enter into that. And one final point to try and deepen it even a little bit more. It's not just that, oh well, this is human life and we might as well make the best of it and enter into this, accept the weakness of it. It's more than that. The weakness is itself a revelation of God. It is the gateway par excellence to an experience of who God really is. Think how weak God is. We speak about God's omnipotence and His majesty, and we project all sorts of human nonsense about it as if this kind of overweening strength and confidence. Really? What does St. Paul say in the very same letter to the Corinthians in the first chapter? He says, Christ crucified is the manifestation of God, not some philosophical stuff that you just tried to preach in Athens to no avail. He says, Christ crucified is the revelation of God's face. The weakness of God is stronger than human strength. The folly and the madness of God is wiser than human wisdom. It turns all our human notions and norms upside down to make us realize it is in the weakness of our condition that we actually find a revelation of God's own weakness. The crucified Christ in all His weakness is the revelation of God. So we claim. Do we really believe it? Do we really follow that? Christ into His weakness, into the human weakness of the human situation? Paul himself had to learn it, as he says in the second letter to the Corinthians. He complained to God about this persistent trouble, this thorn in his flesh, which scholars have debated. What was he talking about? Something that he couldn't overcome. He wasn't strong enough. He wasn't perfect enough, so he felt like it wasn't right. And God says, no. My power is made perfect in your weakness. That's where you find me, in your weakness, not in your perfection. Where have we gotten this insidious notion that we have to be perfect for God to love us? On the contrary, what we have to be is honest. Just bring our weakness. That's where He can find us, because that's where God is. So Paul marvels at this and exclaims in the letter to the Corinthians, it's when I'm weak that I'm strong. Henceforth I'm going to glory in my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ can dwell in me, which works in weakness and as weakness on the cross. Why don't we get it after 2,000 years? So this is the great mystery. God is found in weakness rather than in strength and power. I repeat, God is found in weakness rather than in strength and power. It's right there in front of us, right there inside us. We have just the willingness to look at it, to let the Spirit of God bring us into our weakness and into the weakness of others, in the Spirit of Jesus, who was there to heal and be compassionate and share and be in fellowship with, in communion with, not the perfection, but with the imperfection. Wow. How liberating is that? So if we're truly present to daily circumstances, to our own life, to our own feelings, to other people in their own situation, if we practice the prayer of the presence of God, or the providence of God, or the Jesuit idea of being in the moment, contemplatives, then we'll get this. We'll be able to live it. So let's find in our weakness the doorway to God. Let's find in our despair In our despair, the doorway to hope. That's the wondrous and liberating message of the gospel. Don't run away from it. Be grateful for your fragility. It's the key that opens the door.